Hello everybody again and welcome to the 18th ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Dominant Firms and the Economy. Our speaker is Thomas Philippon from New York University. Thomas is the Max Heine Professor of Finance at New York University Stern School of Business. He was named one of the top 25 economists under 45 by the IMF in 2014. He's the winner of the 2013 Bernacer Prize for Best European Economist under 40, the 2010 Michael Brennan and BlackRock Award, the 2009 Prize for Best Young French Economist, and the 2008 Breton Prize for Best Paper in Corporate Finance. Philippon's research interests are focused on systemic risk and financial crisis, the dynamics of corporate investment and household debt, financial innovation and financial regulation, Eurozone crisis. He currently serves as an academic advisor to the Financial Stability Board and the Hong Kong Institute for Monetary and Financial Research. Today's webinar draws from his recent book, The Great Reversal, and is about the current role of large firms in the economy. Firms like Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft seem to become increasingly dominant, and there is a new debate about whether they have become too dominant. In today's talk, Thomas will present his work on dominant firms, discussing where and especially why they have become dominant, in the hope of making any welfare assessment about this phenomenon. Without further ado, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudio, and thank you all for joining us. So feel free to ask me questions during the talk. I will leave some time at the end for further questions as well. So this is based on work I've been doing the past few years, in particular with my former student, Herman Gutierrez, and a bunch of other co-authors. So the idea really was to understand the role of large firms in the economy. Now, this is not a new question. Large firms have played a key role in the economy, at least since the Industrial Revolution. But they are back in the news with people asking questions about are they too big? Why are they become so big? And is there something we should do about it? So the first thing to keep in mind is the backdrop. So those as a broad brush, if you look at census data from the US, you see that both in the manufacturing sector and in the non-manufacturing sector, the market share of the large firm is higher today than it was in the 80s or 90s. Now, it's important to understand that these are based on industrial classifications, so they are not what we would call antitrust markets. So that's not direct evidence for or against changes in competition. But it does tell you that something is going on in the sense that the large, the top firms in many industries seem to have become larger, at least relative to their industry. It's true in manufacturing and in non-manufacturing. The underlying causes might be a little bit different. What we show in another paper is that at least maybe half of what you see for the manufacturing sector is actually a response to foreign trade. So the reason is because when we measure these things, we look at national data, domestic data, and so you count the market share of domestic firms, but you don't take into account foreign trade. If you did take into account foreign trade, then the concentration manufacturing actually hasn't gone up that much. It's just that domestic firms have been replaced by foreign firms. In the non-manufacturing sector, it's mostly a domestic story. Okay, so that's kind of the broad picture backdrop. There is many details to be discussed here if you want later, but that's kind of the big picture. Now, the interesting question is, what does that mean? And to make it simple, let's imagine we want to understand whether concentration is a good sign or a bad sign. Well, it depends. Right? The first thing to understand is that concentration is the outcome of firms making entry and exit decisions and investment decisions. So concentration is not a primitive, it's not something that's given. It's the outcome of economic growth of various firms. So therefore, the reason underlying the change in concentration is going to make it such that it could be either good or bad. Good concentration is the kind of concentration that comes together with low prices and high productivity growth. Typically, what happens in this case is that you have an industry which perhaps is already somewhat concentrated, but where the best firms, so the firms that were already at the top, get even better. So because of that, and why? How does in practice? How does it happen? Well, in practice, it's at least in the last 20 years, it's mostly when these large firms manage to make efficient, intangible investments to give them structural advantage over their competitors. But in the big picture, that's good news, right? Because so what we're going to see in the data is the top firms were already at the top. Now they get even better. As they get even better, prices, productivity is going to go up, quality is going to go up, prices are going to go down. So that's all the good news. Now, of course, mechanically, you're also going to see an increase in concentration because these firms were already at the top and now they're getting even further ahead of everybody else. So that would be concentration, but it would come together with good properties. And this is the kind of concentration we see in retail and wholesale trade in the US. The bad type of concentration is kind of the opposite. It's when instead of being driven by innovation by the top firms, concentration is driven by barriers to entry. And when you put barriers to entry, you protect yourself against external competition. And therefore, you don't have to invest in quality, you don't have to lower your prices, and you don't have to try very hard to be productive. Why? Because you're protected against competition. So this kind of concentration then comes together with high prices and low productivity. And this is what we see in the telecom sector, airlines, and healthcare in the US. So I'll give you a concrete example. Let's look at an example of good concentration. Good in the sense that it's good for consumers, just to be clear. You may also want to think about the labor market and maybe monopoly power or various other issues that can happen in the labor market. Here, I'm just taking the perspective of consumers. So what you see is the expansion of Walmart in the US. So Walmart was tiny up to the 1980s, and then its market share went from essentially 0 to more than 50%. So it's as remarkable an expansion as we've seen anywhere. From tiny to by far the largest private employer in the US. What's interesting is the expansion of Walmart did not come with higher profit margins. In fact, if anything, you can see the profit margin, which is measured on the left axis, slightly going down. It's kind of either flat or going down over time. So what that means is that when Walmart was making all the intangible investment in, to get just-in-time inventories, inventory management by retailers on their website, all these innovations that now we take for granted, many of them were developed and perfected by Walmart in the 90s. So that led to higher productivity. With that higher productivity, Walmart could cut its price and then gain market share. But what that means is that every 1% productivity gain that Walmart achieved was passed on as a 1% drop in price for the consumers. And you can see it because their profit margin didn't go up. Okay, so when we see that, we're going to say, yeah, sure, there is concentration, but consumers are getting a good deal. In addition, we see towards the end of the sample, so after 2005, something else is interesting. So at that point, Walmart has achieved a very dominant position, one would argue, right? Because it's like 55% of the supermarket sector. And so by that time, if you read the price around the mid 2000s, there is lots of discussion that maybe we should do something about Walmart. It's too big, it's too powerful. So people are thinking about antitrust actions against Walmart. But just as they start to think carefully about doing it, they realize they don't have to, because right at the time, Amazon shows up. and start to compete head-on with Walmart. So Walmart is an interesting story in many dimensions. Remarkable growth, but in a competitive sector, so profit margins didn't go up. That means the productivity gains were essentially transferred to consumers to a large extent. And as the firm becomes too dominant, or arguably perhaps too dominant, then the market solves the problem by creating a new competitor, which is Amazon in this case. And interestingly, also, Amazon was not even classified in the same industry code as Walmart. So that's classic, the competition comes from somewhere you didn't expect. So this is what we like to see. Okay. Now, the counterexample of that is the telecom industry in the US. And here you can see the evolution of the market share of the top 8. I should have said CR means concentration ratio. And 8 means just look at the top 8 firms. You can do CR4, CR8, CR20. So this is the market share of the top 8. And you see that that's the red dots, and it's going up quite a bit, in fact, a lot. And this is one measure of the markup that these guys can charge. So you can see the markup going up also a lot. So these are massive changes in prices, profit margins, and they are going to be bad for consumer welfare. People are going to pay much higher prices for telecom services in the US. And in fact, they do. So this is, for instance, the cost of broadband internet at home. And you can see that the US is a lot more expensive than pretty much every other developed rich country. And this actually was the initial motivation for my book, The Great Reversal, because what's remarkable is not just the situation today, or this data is from 2018, but if anything, it's gotten worse after. What's remarkable is not just this situation as of 2018, but the fact that 20 years earlier, it was the opposite. If you had done the same kind of calculation using data from the 2000s or late 90s, you would have found that the US had less expensive access to internet than France, a lot less expensive. Why? Because France was under a monopoly, France Telecom, and they were charging high prices. In the case of the late 90s, of course, it was like a dial-up modems, and so they would charge you by the minute. In the US, local calls were free, so access to internet was much cheaper in the US than in France. Okay, so what's remarkable is not just that today households in the US pay a lot more than anybody else for getting internet at home, but also that it's a complete reversal from the situation 20 years before that. And this is for internet access. Of course, if you look at the price of cell phone plans, it's the difference are if anything, they are bigger than that. So getting a cell phone in the US is at least twice as expensive as it is in Italy or France. And it's all due to competition in Europe. Okay, so that is now we have two examples, right? So good competition with Walmart, good concentration with Walmart, bad concentration with the example of the telecoms. The question is, what is it on average? And are there other metrics we could look at? So one that I like very much is this turnover measure. Okay, so the thing that's important to understand is when we compute CR8 like here, or the market share of Walmart like here, these are static numbers, right? Every triangle here looks at that point in time, what was the market share of Walmart? But intuitively, we understand that maybe it doesn't really matter if a firm has a very high market share today, but it's very unlikely to be able to maintain this market share for the next, say, 5 years. Then perhaps it doesn't really matter that it has a high market share, right? The market share is a static concept, while what we really care about is the dynamic of competition. And so that's why this turnover measure comes in. So here what we do is very simple. We just rank firms within their industry according to who is the bigger one. Of course, big You could define it by total revenues, sales, so that's the green line, or you could define it by market value of the equity. Turns out it doesn't make a big difference, as you can see. Both definitions give you the same trends. Okay, so you define the top firms in a given year. But instead of computing their market share in that year, what you do is you compute the likelihood that they're going to be still at the top of their industry 5 years later. Okay. And what you can see here is the average reshuffling within industry. That is the average, essentially, fraction of top firms who get reshuffled. And it was something like, say, 12%. That means that, take any industry or take the average industry, top firms had a 12% chance of dropping out of the top. And I think this is defined for the top 5. 12% chance of dropping out of the top 5 in any given 5-year window. So that's a sign of a healthy capitalism, right? Because again, it could be the case that at a point in time, they have a high market share, but they are not super likely to keep it forever. The problem is, as you can see, since the 2000, this reshuffling rate, which was around 12%, has essentially been divided by 2. So now it's closer to 6%. Okay, what that means is that the dominant firms are more entrenched than they used to be. So to me, now this measure is much more complicated to compute than the market share. So that's why it's not as widely used. But I do believe that it is actually a better measure of what we mean by competition. Another way to look at it is just to look at the top 100 companies in the US and ask yourself how many have been there for at least 10 years. So this data runs from 2000 to 2020. So let's take 2000. So 2045. That means if you look at the 100 largest company in the year 2000 in the US, 45 of these companies had been in the top for the previous 10 years. That is from 1991 to 2000. Every year. Of course, what that means is that 55 of them were not in the top 10, in the top 100 every year. Okay? They are newcomers in that sense. And as you can see here, the fraction of firms who've been in the top 10 over the previous 10 years goes up. Okay? That's another way of looking at the decline in reshuffling. So what this is saying is that it's not so much that the big firms are big, it's that the fact that they've been there forever. Okay. So in 2019, so say right before COVID, out of the top 100 company in the US in 2019, 71 of them had been in the top 100 every single year from 2010 to 2019 for the previous 10 years. So that's evidence for a lack of reshuffling and more entrenchment of large firms. Okay, so why is that? Well, one reason is that a force that was there to kind of to balance market power and to make sure the economy maintains some kind of balanced equilibrium seems to have weakened. That's what I call free entry here. So what you see here is the connection between excess profit and entry. So literally what we do is we look at all industries in the US. We look at Tobin's Q, so the extent to which the market value is more than the book value. So it's a measure that profits are high, either today or expected to be high in the future. And we compute the correlation between that and entry over the following 2 years. Okay, so the change in the log number of firms. What you see is that this was to be a pretty large and positive number. What that means is that, oh, so it's not a correlation, it's the elasticity. So elasticity of 1 means if Q is 1% higher, then entry will be 1% higher over the next 2 years. Okay. Now, this was a pretty high elasticity until the late 1990s. And this is important for rebalancing, because it's tell you that if an industry has a positive shock and suddenly profits are high and expected to remain high, so Q is high, then the market forces are going to tell firms, well, you should enter that industry. Okay. Why? Because profits are high there. But in doing so, of course, they will bring the profits down. Okay, so that's exactly what we want capitalism to do. Stuff happens, profits go up, profits go down, but there's this fundamental force that if profits get too high somewhere, then firms are going to enter and compete away these profits. Now, the problem of that force, as you can see, is it's weakened a lot. And today, the correlation is really close to zero. So there's not this tendency of firms to enter very high profit margin industry as essentially weakened to close to zero. Okay, so that explains also part of the entrenchment of dominant firms. Okay, so if you put all the pieces together, one thing we try to do in the macro paper with Matias Covarrubias and Aman Gutierrez was to try to summarize all of that. Okay, and as I told you, there is like good and bad concentration. I mean, that's a little bit of a caricature, of course, but it's still a useful way to think about it. And we wanted to know what's the prevalence of the good type versus the bad type concentration. And so we computed this principal component based on the evolution of concentration, but also prices in entry, investment, and especially intangible investment. And it turns out the data actually sorts itself out a little bit like the simple model. You have a principal component that we call intangible because it loads heavily on high intangible investment. And it looks like good concentration because investment is high, especially in intangible, prices are going down, and there is entry of new firms. And in the 1990s, it was the dominant firm. So, and then this is the principal, so this is just the weight, the prevalence on the principal component. So green was higher than red. That means this was the more common type of concentration. And the red one, which is the opposite, the one that looks like barriers to entry. So that's the one where we see high prices, lack of entry, and not much investment. This was not very prevalent. And what happened over the following 20 years is not so much that the first one disappeared, it's still there, but that the other one became more important. Okay, so my view of the US is we still have plenty of industries that go through these competitive cycles. But we used to have very few that had these non-competitive cycles. And this is what changed. Today, we have many industries that have these non-competitive dynamics. Okay, so the red became relatively more prevalent than the green. All right, so this is the overview for the US. Now, what about Europe? What we see in Europe is an interesting contrast because to some extent, Europe started from a worse baseline. So traditionally, American markets are more competitive than European markets. And that was true definitely through the 1980s and 90s. In fact, there were many papers written at the time in the late 90s, early 2000, arguing that Europe should adopt a type of regulation of markets inspired by the US that would lead to more competition in European markets. There is a famous paper, in fact, by Alberto Alesina and Guido Tabellini making exactly that point. The thing is, Europeans actually kind of did that slowly. So maybe it was not very spectacular from one year to the next, but they kind of did it. So this counts the number of product market reforms. And you can see that, you know, somewhere between the mid-90s and the mid-2000s, then we have about one large scale pro-competition reform per country per year. Of course, one per country per year doesn't sound that much, right? Because if you live in a country, it means there is one industry that perhaps is getting more competitive. So that might look very slow from your perspective. But if you accumulate that over 10 years, then you start to see an impact. And again, let's go back to my example of the telecom. This is the kind of thing we see. So this is the relative price of communication services in France relative to the US. So France was like 15 to 20% more expensive than the US until somewhere around 2011. And then there was a very sharp reversal. What is that? Well, that's the entry of Free Mobile. Okay, so Free was asking for a license to compete against the three incumbents. We had an oligopoly of three incumbent firms in the telecom market. And of course, they were colluding implicitly to keep prices high and not compete too hard. Then Free got a license. That means it could enter that market. A license together with an agreement to be able to start. So there's plenty of interesting details in the background there. Just giving them a license itself would not have been enough. So they got the license, they got a step in just to be able to start their operations. And they very quickly started to compete aggressively. Essentially, they cut the price in half. So the exact same cell phone plan that cost 40 euros with France Telecom, Free marketed that thing at 20 euros. So they started to gain market share. The incumbent reacted by cutting their own prices. And lo and behold, very quickly, the French telecom market became very competitive. Today, France is one of the best places to get internet connection at home and to get a cell phone. And this is all thanks to this kind of competition. So the OECD has like a summary measure of product market regulations, PMR. And each dot here is one country in Europe. This is Poland, Greece, and the red line is the US. And I think that's a good example of what I mean. So if you look at the graph from 1 year to, or these are of course not every year. So these are vintages every 5 years. Actually, yeah, 5 or 7, I forgot. 5, I think. So from one vintage to the next, you don't really see a big difference. But if you accumulate over 20 years, well, then you do see a big drift. Like today, essentially, all of the countries in Europe are close to the US. In fact, if anything, the average is slightly below the US. Okay, so they have less regulation. Okay, or I should have said the PMRs are it's an index of anti-competitive regulation, say barriers to entry, for instance. It looked like several dimensions and it adds them up. So the worst score would be like a 4 and the best score would be like a 0. Okay, so these are essentially barriers to competition. So today, most countries in Europe don't have more barriers to competition than the US. In fact, many have fewer barriers than the US. Concentration so it turns out comparing concentration across countries is very tricky because the definitions are always a bit different. But the thing that's striking is the service sector, where you see this very sharp increase in the US, North America, that includes Canada. And some increase, but less so in Europe. And the thing to keep in mind, of course, is in Europe, we also have the single market effect, which is that some of the concentration we see in Europe reflects the Walmart style competition, which is firm expanding across boundaries in Europe. So at the end of the day, what does that mean for welfare? Well, if you look at markups, and markups are tricky to estimate. So again, there's plenty of ways to do it. I want to think about the markup as being excess profits. So it's not the same definition as the Delocker et al. Markup. This is like a measure of excess profits, really. What you can see is that in Europe, I think it's pretty flat. Of course, there was a massive profit squeeze during the Eurozone crisis, but probably now we're back to something on trend. But in the US, the markup went up by something between 7 and 10%. And that's a lot of money. Just to put it in perspective, that's about $300 per household per month. Literally, like their bills at the end of the month are $300 too expensive because of the fact that prices are too high in the US, because many industries have become less competitive. So this $300, that's computed for the median household. If you accumulate across all households in 12 months, that's $600 billion. Okay, that's essentially like the amount of money that gets transferred from the household sector to the firm sector because of higher markups. So that kind of the direct transfer effect. And then you have the inefficiency effect. For that, you need a model to compute it. But if you simulate a macro model with these parameters, this kind of the markups implied by these parameters, and you ask yourself, how much of GDP do we lose from lack of competition? It's about $1 trillion. Okay, so about 5% of private GDP in the US. Why? Well, mostly through lack of investment and entry. Because competitive industries, the great virtue is firms compete like crazy to get market shares, and so that they are forced to hire and forced to invest. And when you decrease the competitive pressure, then the firms have fewer incentive to invest and hire, and that leads to a drop in output. That's the main channel. So that costs about $1 trillion of GDP. The interesting thing, of course, is it's not evenly distributed, because if you were to bring competition back up, you would gain $1 trillion of GDP. So that's the pie you would expand, but it would not expand the same proportion for everyone. Because when you lower prices, you have a good impact on the purchasing power of workers. But by definition, you reduce the profit margins of firms, okay, because they cannot charge the same high price. So the evolution of profits is not obvious. GDP goes up, so there is more activity, but on the other hand, their margin goes down. So the product of the two, quantity time margin, who knows? In practice, it goes down. Okay, so the margin effect is stronger. So my simulations, not only you increase GDP by $1 trillion, but also you increase labor income by 1.25. So that means that profits go down by $250 billion. So that's like a redistribution effect. And it's relatively important because who loses from that? People, shareholders. And the thing with shareholders is it's very concentrated. The people who are owning stocks of shares of stock, they tend to be in the top of the wealth distribution, while labor income is much more evenly distributed. So when you transfer from shareholders to workers, you actually reduce inequality. Okay, so that's why I think competition would be good for the US economy, with higher GDP and also less inequality. Okay, so I think that's kind of the big picture for what happened in the US over the past 20 years and for what's happened in Europe over the same period. Now, of course, the one thing I haven't done is to focus on, Google, Amazon, and Co. Why? Well, because part of my exercise was to look at similar industries, say the telecom industry or the airlines in Europe and in the US. Okay. Because that way I could compare industries where the technology was similar. The problem with Google, Facebook, and Apple is we don't have the equivalent in Europe. Therefore, it's hard to make the comparison. So what did I do instead? Well, I'm going to look at these guys compared to the stars of the past, okay? Because I don't have like an Apple in Europe. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to compare the top firms in the US today to the top firms in the US 50 years ago. So it's a very different type of comparison. But it's still very instructive. So the first thing you notice is that the claim that big firms have become, that star firms have become very large is actually not really true. And part of it is because people are comparing apples and oranges. So when you look at firm level data, say revenues, most firms, of course, publish their consolidated worldwide income. So Apple's revenues is Apple worldwide. Now, it turns out half of it comes from abroad. So if you compare Apple's revenues to US GDP, you're not comparing apples to apples, in that case, literally. Because you're comparing a domestic concept, US GDP, to a global concept. So there's two things you could do. You could compare Apple's global revenues to global GDP, or you could compare Apple's domestic revenue to domestic GDP. So here I do the domestic to domestic. What you can see on this graph is the The non-adjusted series is at the top. Okay, so this is top 4 by industry. So what I do is I take, for each industry, take the 4 largest firm in that industry, and I look at the ratio of their sales relative to US GDP. And you see this guy is going up. Okay, that's going up. And that's the fact that people mention, yeah, the star firms are becoming very, very large relative to GDP. That is true, but it's mostly due to foreign income. So if you do their domestic revenues relative to domestic GDP, it's actually flat over the last 20 years. And if anything, it's actually slightly less than it was in the 1970s. Or in other words, Apple is big, but so was AT&T. And then this is by top 4 by industry. This, the green is the top 20 for the whole economy. Okay, so the first thing to understand is it is not really true that these firms are very, very big. We always had big firms in the US, and it's not clear that the big firms of today are that much bigger. Okay, so as I said, there's 2 ways you could do the adjustment. The other way was to do it via global to global. Okay, so now I take the global revenues of the biggest firms in the world and I scale it by global GDP. So now Apple would be together with other top firms in the world. But I don't compare their total revenues to the GDP of their country of origin. I compare it to total world GDP. And again, what you see is that over the past 20 years, it's either flat or slightly declining. Okay. Actually, you know what? Give me 1 second. I hear the fire drill thingy there, and I want to make sure I can stay to finish that. So sorry, I have to step out for 2 minutes to make sure that I can avoid the fire drill and keep the video going. So I'll be back in like 30 seconds. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, it was like, you know, we have these fire drills all the time, or I guess 1 per semester, and they always find a way to make the drills at a time where it's not convenient. So I was at this thing. Yeah, so I mean, think about a simple example that would be even more telling for Europe. Take Nokia, okay? So if you compute the ratio of Nokia's sales to the GDP of Finland, that would be a huge number. And then you would say, oh my God, these dominant firms have become so large. Of course, but Nokia sales were all abroad, okay? So you don't want to compare the sales of Nokia, the global sales of Nokia to the GDP of Finland. What you could do is do the domestic sales of Nokia to the GDP of Finland, or the global sales of Nokia to the GDP of the world. Okay. So this one here, the one in the middle here does domestic to domestic, and this one does global to global. And they both tell the same story, which is large firms are large. They've always been large. They have a big share of the economy, but it's not true that over the past 20 years, they've taken over the market share of everybody else. Okay, so I think the superstar story is a bit misleading in that sense. Another way of saying it is that Apple is growing fast. That is true, but so is China. Okay, so if you just maintain your market share in China, you're going to grow very fast. Right, so I think that's the first thing to understand. A very related concept that people mention always is the idea that winner take all has become the rule of the game today. And I also think that's wrong. It's wrong in the sense that it's either it's always been there or it's not there, but it's not new. Okay. So let's do a simple test. So here what I do is I look at the market value of the top firm relative to firm number 2. Okay, again, within this industry, and then I take the median across all industries. That's the green line. The red one does the same thing, except I compare the top firms, the top firm, sorry, in the industry, compared to the average of firms 2, 3, 4, 5. And you see the trends are the same. So it's focused on the green one. So the first thing is, this is a big number, like 50%, 100%. That means that in your typical industry, the top firm is, twice, between 50% and 100% more valuable than the next firm. So if you think about distributions, that's a very fat tail. Okay, there's no question about that. It's not as if the top firm is 10% more valuable than the next one. It's 50% or even 100% more valuable than the next one. So there is a lot of fat tail. That's a fact, I agree. But it's not a new fact. It's always been there. If you look at this ratio, there's no trend up over the past 20 years. So you could argue that winner take all was always a feature of capitalism, and that's partly true. But you cannot argue that it's more true today, at least based on this data. Okay. Now, again, why is that? I think it's because there are so many industries where the same thing we talk about today for, say, Apple or Google was true before, like pharmaceutical industry, like essentially extremely high fixed cost and zero marginal cost, same story. Okay. So you had this winner take all effect in the past in many industries. Okay, and the last point on which I want to spend a bit of time is productivity. So this is the contribution of the top firms to aggregate productivity in the US. Now, productivity here is labor product. It's not TFP. It's labor productivity. Why? Because measuring TFP at the firm level is kind of annoying. We don't have good enough data for that. So this is just labor productivity. And this is what we call the inside or the internal effect of productivity. This is the within firm productivity growth. And this number is not a ratio, it's the amount contributed. Okay, so this point, say, take the 1985, this point here, it's like close to 1%. That means that if you take just the top 100 firms in the US, so it's very few firms, just these 100 firms created 1% of total labor productivity growth for the entire US economy. Okay, so that's a very big number. Why is it? How can it be so big? How can it be that in an economy such as large as the US, just 100 firms can create so much productivity? Because these firms are very large. Okay, so that's the point of the previous slides. Yeah, it is fat tailed. So large firms are very large. When they do well, they have an impact on the aggregate. But what you can see is that if anything, over the past 20 years, this contribution has decreased. Okay. So the within contribution of the top 100 firms is lower. In fact, it's close to zero now, compared to something like 50 basis points or 1% in the past. So that's also something which is different from the typical view of superstar firms. I mean, the fact is that their within productivity growth is not that impressive. Now, of course, you could argue that productivity, aggregate productivity, could come from each firm becoming more productive. That's the within component. Or it could be from reallocating resources towards firms that are already more productive. Okay. That's the reallocation component. So let's look at this, the two pieces and then the sum. Okay, so the green line, it's called Hulton. It's exactly the same as this one. It's called Hulton because it's based on Hulton's theorem for how you decompose productivity growth. Okay, so this is the within effect. This is holding the allocation across firms constant. This is the contribution of each firm becoming more productive and how it's moving up the aggregate productivity of the economy. And we've already seen that the Hulton component, the within, was pretty high, but today it's actually close to zero. The red one is the reallocation. And this one is kind of the opposite. It's actually higher today than it was in the past. So the reallocation is you have two firms. Say you have like Google and some other service firm. And Google is a lot more productive in level than the other firm. So even if Google doesn't grow its own productivity, because its level is much higher than the next guy, if they hire more people, then the weighted average productivity in the economy is going to go up. Okay, that's the reallocation effect. And this one is higher. today than it was in the past. If you add them up, so the sum of within and reallocation is the blue one with the squares, you can see that the total contribution is very high. In fact, the first thing to realize is this number here, the first time I saw it, I really thought there was a typo in my code because I couldn't believe it would be so high. But this is true. This is literally like 1.7%. So just the 100 largest firms in the US added 1.7% of total labor productivity, of GDP, to the US economy. Why? Because in the 1990s, you had great within contribution and great reallocation together. And today, what do we have? Well, we have pretty good reallocation, but we have pretty bad within. So the sum total is kind of mediocre, definitely less than what it used to be. Okay, so again, that is not consistent with the superstar story. This is more like fading stars. Okay, we still have star firms. They are still amazing. They still do great products, but we had star firms in the past. It's not new that you have great firms in the economy. The only question is, are they great compared to what great firms usually do? And the answer is, well, not really. Okay. They are pretty good, but there's no sense in which they are outstanding compared to the great firms of the past. We can talk about, well, you know what, let's skip that because I want to leave some time for questions. So that's all I wanted to say in my remarks. I'm now happy to answer questions. Now I see the Q&A, so maybe I can